Well, thank you very much to the Architecture Foundation for the invitation to present the Housing Atlas Europe 20th Century. My name's Mark Swenarton. I'm a professor at Liverpool University, and this book was written by four people from different countries and with distinctive intellectual histories. Orsina Simona Pierini, who was the instigator of the project, from Milan; Carmen Espekel from Madrid; Dick van Gameren from Delft; and myself. And I'll say a little bit more about each of those authors in a moment. It's quite a big book. If you haven't seen it, it's big pages, and there's 380 of them, weighs about 2.5 kilos. There's 700 new drawings that were done for the book, covering 87 projects, and there's also 4 essays and an index. So one might indeed call it a weighty tome. How I became involved, I'm a historian. I've focused a lot of my interest on 20th century housing, really for the whole of my career. Starting at the beginning of my career, I was working on the early 20th century, particularly on the Garden City movement and how that model became adopted for the local authority housing, Homes Fit for Heroes of the 1920s, focusing on Raymond Unwin, who was the central figure in all of that. More recently, I've been looking at post-Second World War housing, particularly at the work of Neve Brown and the other architects who were engaged by Camden Council in the 1960s and 1970s. And some of you may know my book, Cook's Camden, which came out in 2017, which was a big piece of research. It was 10 years' work. But it included, relevantly for what we're talking about today, redrawing of all the main projects. The plans and sections were all redrawn for me for that book. And that really opened my eyes to the value of redrawing as a way of getting to grips with and understanding the architecture of complex projects. After that book, Cook's Camden, was published, I was invited to give the opening keynote at a conference in Portugal. And also speaking at that conference were two of the contributors, two of the authors of the Housing Atlas. And that was where I had the opportunity to meet them. First of all, Orsina Simona Pierini from the Polytechnic of Milan. Now, she has worked on European housing for many years. She published a very nice book in 2012 called The Housing Primer, and then a magnum opus, a fantastic work on housing in Milan, which came out in 2017, for which she redrew the floor plans and sections and elevations of a large number of 20th century housing projects in Milan. Also at the conference was Carmen Espekel from the Polytechnic of Madrid, who likewise had published a major work on social housing, on 20th century Spanish housing, collective housing in Spain, 1929 to 1992. Which came out in 2013. And again, this included a huge number of new drawings of these housing projects. And in fact, Simona and Carmen had collaborated in various ways prior to this Housing Atlas project. The fourth member of the team, of what would become the team, is Dick van Gameren, from TU Delft. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture at Delft, and he also works with Meccano, whose work you may be familiar with, and he's done a project in London. Now, for the last, 15 years or so, Dick has been publishing this really good periodical, Dash, which is Delft Architectural Studies on Housing. There's 17 volumes now. And for that, he and his colleagues redraw. You're beginning to see the theme of this, redraw, particularly 20th century and recent housing projects. And I'd actually met Dick, not at that Porto conference, but as in connection with a previous project that I worked on, Architecture in the Welfare State, where my collaborators were professors at Delft. And so I was going over there quite regularly. And when we were working on that, they'd introduced me to him. So they were all people that I'd met and whose work I highly respected. And so when the opportunity arose to join them on this Housing Atlas project, I was absolutely delighted to do so. Excuse me. So just to give you the timeline, 2019, I met Simona and Carmen at that conference. I introduced Simona then to Lund Humphreys, who were my publishers, and I was then invited by her to join the project. That was in February 2020, and as you'll all know, the following month, a rather dreadful event hit us all, which was COVID. And so we were all knocked out by that, particularly my colleagues who were, unlike me, who are still actively teaching, and they had to sort out all their teaching commitments in the light of COVID. So we didn't actually start until June of 2020. That was the first of our monthly meetings, all of which, of course, were online because of COVID. But anyway, we got down to it, and it was a fantastic process working with these eminent collaborators. And it took us 2.5 years till we got the job done and handed over the whole thing to the publisher. And I think it's quite an interesting way of working, because a project like this you might otherwise expect to have resulted from a multi-pound or euro research project involving, a 6 or 7 figure sum and a huge bureaucracy. But we didn't do it that way. It was basically 4 people who were passionate about housing, who respected each other's expertise and just wanted to get together and produce this volume. And I think it's a way of working that has a lot to recommend it. There's no bureaucracy. You just these are colleagues that you want to work with, and you just get on with it and do it. And so it was, as I say, it was 2.5 years in the making. But what it was drawing on was literally decades of research that we had all done. I did at one point kind of tot it up, and I think I came to 150 years of background research or prior research that had been undertaken by the 4 authors and that fed into this project. So handover end of 22, and then publication was at the end, right at the end of last year. Excuse me. So what did we want to do? What was the object of the exercise? Well, what we wanted to do was bring together into one volume some of the major European housing projects from the 20th century that still have lessons for today. So it wasn't ever going to be a piece of art history or archaeology, kind of looking into things, tracing connections for their own sake. What we're interested in is building housing today. And so we want to look at the housing of the 20th century to see what lessons can be learned from it. So it's very much focused on now, even though we are looking back. And we wanted to present these projects using the same graphic conventions and with drawings at the same scale to allow for ready comparison. We all know a lot of these projects from their original drawings, but the drawings are themselves often rhetorical. And when you strip that out and actually present them scientifically in the same way it becomes possible to compare and understand in a way that it's not when they're all presented according to the original architect's own graphic style and intentions. And we wanted to show the plans not just of the site and the individual units, but of entire floors. So it often happens that one thinks of the kind of typological plan on the one hand, the urban plan, and then the unit. But what we were particularly interested in was the relationship between the units, because we're interested in this notion of how we live together in the city. We all occupy homes, we have neighbours. What's the relationship between us in our household and our neighbours, and then in turn how we relate as a collectivity to the city at a broader scale. And so as part of that, we're interested in the relationship between private and public, if you like, from the bedroom to the boulevard. What is the route that people take when they go about their daily lives, moving from their room or their living room within the home out into the public realm of the city? And so we have standard scales for the drawings, 1 to 10,000 for the urban plan, 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 500 for the building layout, and 1 to 250 for the unit plans. And I should make it clear that the drawings, the redrawings, were done by the other three. Because I am no longer actively employed at my university, I don't have a bevy of postdoctoral students on whom I can call to do this kind of work. And so it's my co-authors who did this. Simona did the largest chunk, and then the rest, the other part, was done by Carmen and Dick. And because I wasn't responsible for the drawings, I can say dispassionately that they are, I think, remarkably beautiful drawings. They're done with real style and aplomb, as well as absolute accuracy. And then finally, for each project, we wanted to present a standard data grid and a thumbnail description so that you can get your head around the project really easily. And then also we wanted to have individual essays by the four authors. So this is the bulk of the work is a collective undertaking, which we all shared and agreed on. But then, having collaborated on that, we each wanted to say, okay, that's the collaboration, but we all have our individual perspective and our individual view of the subject, and we want to each present that in an introductory essay. And so this is the contents page of the book. We ended up with 87 projects, and they're arranged purely chronologically. We spent quite a bit of time discussing different ways of organizing the projects, and there are pros and cons of every way. You could do it typologically, location, density, whatever. But we felt that actually the most useful is just to do it one after the other and not pre-impose any kind of pattern, because if you group some things together, then inevitably you're grouping them away from something else, and that is not necessarily helpful. So we thought just have them absolutely straight chronologically. So the projects start here and end up here. I'll show you those in a second. And then we have the 4 introductory essays at the beginning over here. So the first project in the sequence is Hampstead Garden Suburb, started in 1905 by Parker and Unwin in London. And the last is the Rue des Suisses in Paris by Herzog and de Meuron of 1996. And these are typical opening spreads where you have the situation plan, you have the floor plan, photograph, brief description, and grid, and then project grid, and then you turn over and you then have the cell plans at the larger scale. Excuse me. So to give you a flavour of the projects and the way we present them, I thought I'd talk about them in three groups. And the first of these are what I call the stalwarts, which are the projects that everybody would expect to find in a work of this sort. And so I show you here the Karl Marxhof, the kind of canonic project of the Socialist City Council of Vienna in the 1920s, where they took the aristocratic form of the courtyard and made it far bigger than it had ever been before. So it became a courtyard that spread across entire city blocks, expressing this new power of the proletariat. And also from the 1920s, also with a political ambition, but a very different formal solution, one of the Zeilenbau projects, parallel row building of this new kind of scientific approach of the 1920s. This is from Frankfurt, where Ernest May was the city architect. Ernest May, who had actually worked with Unwin at Hampstead Garden Suburb before the war, but a very different approach to that. Everything's arranged in parallel format, optimal insulation, standardization of the dwelling. Then from the post-war period, of course, we have the Unité d'habitation of Le Corbusier, one of the absolutely central projects to which so many refer, and to which becomes a kind of benchmark for so much subsequent housing. Park Hill, the first and in many ways, I think, the most successful of those projects of the streets in the sky. This was a notion that Le Corbusier had set out actually in the Unité, and which stimulated great interest, particularly in the UK. We're very attached to the street in the UK, so architects here thought, well, that sounds a great idea. If we can take the street and put it up in the sky, wouldn't that be a good solution? Well, I think there are differing views about that, but this one, Park Hill, I think is one of the most interesting. And you can see here the kind of typical way in which we present it, with the situation plan, the typological plan, and then the unit plans here, the 1 to 250. Squinting at them, I think they're 1 to 250 in this case. Beaufields, Walden 7, which really broke from those scientific, quasi-scientific ideas and went towards a notion of intimacy and enclosure, and really set out, I think, a path that a lot of architects continued to follow for many years after. And then a much cooler approach of Nouvelle at Nemesis in Nîmes, with these two blocks which in a way seem to look back to the Zeilenbau. They're like two ships that have landed, but in this case they've landed in the way they have in order to preserve the landscape that was that pre-existed. I could talk a lot more about these, but I think now's not the time to do so. What I'd like to talk about, though, is some of my favourites from the works, and then I'll talk a bit about things I learned from doing the project. Now, this, I think, is a really nice project. This is a very early matte project from Rome. Design started in 1950. Cortiero Quartiere Tuscolano by Libera. And I think in the UK, we tend to think of mat housing as having come from the unrealised projects of Le Corbusier and then through the northern route, through Utzon's projects. But here's a project right from the beginning of the 50s, which is exploring in a very interesting way how you can treat housing as a mat from which you excavate open space. So here are the courtyards within, here are this group of 4 units with each with their own courtyard. So you treat the building as like a carpet, and you then excavate your open space from within that carpet. And I think this is a really underknown project in the UK, not underknown in Italy and elsewhere in Europe. Another project which in some ways refers to similar ideas, but in a very idiosyncratic way, Sterling and Gowan's Avenham housing in Preston, unfortunately, not with us now, but a really, really interesting return to the street, but not in a kind of literal way. It's a courtyard. The main block is a courtyard housing here with this pedestrian access, which clearly does refer back to the notion of the Victorian streets that occupied the site before the project was built, but I think in a very idiosyncratic and rich way. And it's a project that really does repay considerable study. From the 1990s, I think another project that appeals to me, which is also addressing the issue of the fracturing of the urban environment, is Siriani's project at Colombes in Paris. Well, this is an area where there were still single family houses, but there were also large 1950s, 60s blocks, big housing projects. And what Siriani was doing here, was to take that fracturing and that dislocation of scale and attempt to resolve it within the form of the block itself. So at one end, where we have adjacency to these large blocks, we have 7 stories, and then the mass of the project diminishes towards single-story homes at the far end. And I think it's a really interesting project. I enjoy looking at it and thinking about it very much. And then finally, a favourite project, which I think is less well known than the other works by this architect. This is Neve Brown's final housing project, built in the 1990s in Eindhoven. He was invited by Jo Kernen to design the project that would be the linchpin in Kernen's master plan for Eindhoven. And Brown based it on a pedestrian street, so much, in the manner of Alexandra Road. We have a pedestrian street addressed on either side. So here's the pedestrian street here, addressed on either side. And we have a big step section block here, which forms a barrier to a big road here. So it's a bit like Alexandra Road, where you've got this barrier block and a step section. And then each of the units has a garden on the roof of the block in front, and you can see the roof terraces here. So this photo is taken from up here somewhere. I think a very interesting revisit by Brown of the ideas that he'd developed in his Camden projects at Fleet Road and Alexandra Road. So lastly, let me talk about the projects that I discovered or rediscovered as part of the process. And this, in a way, this was the most rewarding part for me, because here I was working with my co-authors and being called on by them to look at or re-look at projects. And it was a huge learning curve. It was really, really exciting. Now, this was one that I'd really overlooked until I did this project. It's in the Netherlands, in The Hague, and it belongs to that immediate post-First World War period when right across Europe, architects were looking at what Unwin had been doing at Hampstead Garden Suburb and elsewhere and trying to emulate it in the housing that they were building. But one of the problems with that was that the cost of land was much higher, and therefore the very low densities of a garden suburb were not achievable. So what Jan Vils did, which I think is really, really clever, is he took the garden suburb idea, but he then did it back to back. So what we've got is actually back to back homes, but they're displaced by half. So I need this to come back. Yeah. So there's one, and the one behind it is displaced by half a unit. And what that means is that each home has a view to the has dual aspect. So if we take this one here, you approach it here, but there's the kitchen and the living room, and it's got a view that way. So by doubling up, you're doubling the density, and that is what enables them to then produce this big communal garden at the beginning. Now, I'm not saying this is what we should all be doing, but I think it's a really interesting take on that model, that inherited model, in order to increase the density while still providing not the same amenity, because you've lost your back garden, but something of the amenity of a garden suburb. And this is another, I think, very interesting and clever invention, which I was aware of. I was aware of Roster, this is in Sweden, but I must admit I'd never looked at it properly until this process. And what this is based on is this star shape plan in which each wing of the star consists of a single dwelling, and you can add as many stars to each other as you want. So there's the basic three-wing star, and there it is there, but we can add another three-wing star to it there, and we can add another one there, and we can add another one there. And so they can go on and link together. And each dwelling has at least two aspects. So we look out that way and that way. If it's in a wing where another star hasn't been added, it also looks out on in the third direction. It looks out here. And even the ones where it's adjacent to an added star, they're still dual aspect. Now, again, I'm not saying this is the answer or this is what we should be doing, but I think it's very interesting. It is open to the objection that it's internally determined. This is really it's like making a daisy chain, which you then arrange around your communal space in whatever way seems appropriate. But I think it's a very interesting idea, and particularly given our concern with dual aspect. Clearly, this is low density, but I think there's a very interesting idea here, which is completely independent of the formal expression of the architecture. Now, this is one in the UK, and again, it's one I knew, but I was forced to look at it again and much more thoroughly as a result of this project, or in the course of this project. This is right in the middle of London. This is in Covent Garden. If you know Covent Garden, the Covent Garden tube station is about there. Leicester Square tube station's there. That's the Royal Opera House in there. That's the Piazza, and it's above some shops and some parking, so you can walk past it quite happily many times and never realise it's there. And it's the result of an attempt, which fortunately was foiled by the Greater London Council, to demolish the whole of Covent Garden. Believe it or not, in the 1960s, that's what the GLC wanted to do. Fortunately, it was prevented in part by a very active community group called the Covent Garden Community Association. And as a kind of prize to them at the end of it all, they were given this site of what had been the Oddham's print works. And Donald Ball, the architect at the GLC, came up with this really interesting scheme where it's all raised up on a podium. So you've got a ramp that leads up into the podium. The ramp leads up from this side and steps from this side. And then within it, you've got a courtyard, which apparently is very romantic and like a North African kind of Moroccan Medina, but is actually highly rational and is organized on a symmetrical basis, diagonal symmetrical basis. And it got really bad press when it was finished at the end of the 1970s. UK critics really panned it. And I'm sorry to say I was subliminally influenced by that, and I'd never really looked at it properly. But Dick Van Gameren said, no, you've got to look at this. It's a really, interesting piece of work. And so I did, and of course we all looked at it, and I dropped my furrowed brow and said, yeah, it's actually a very interesting piece of work which we should look at and include. And this is, I think, a very elegant piece of work. I'm not generally an advocate of high-rise housing or tower blocks, and so this may be surprising to see this in my presentation. But I think it's such a clever design that it really deserves to be applauded. It's Chassé Park, which is this big project in Breda in the Netherlands, and the master plan was by OMA. And then the block that we publish and that I particularly admire are these towers by Xavier de Gaither. And what I think is nice about them is, okay, this is luxury housing, so it's not social housing. It's, the constraints are very different, but nonetheless, it's very, very elegantly done, because on each floor, you've got two units, L-shaped units. So there's one. Just wait for this to come back. And there's the other. And each unit looks out in three directions. It has its own open space, its own balcony. And we have a central core there, and then the two L-shaped blocks which kind of interlink around it. So I think they're 3-bedroom units, and they each look in three directions. Now, I think that's just really neat. You can say, okay, this is luxury housing, it's easy. Well, it's not, because there's lots of luxury housing around that isn't anything like as successful as that. So I think, again, this is a really neat piece of work, and that attracts my attention and applause. And finally, the one that for me was, if I have to name one, which is the biggest discovery for me from this whole process, it's this one. It's in Madrid. It's the Casa de las Flores, the House of Flowers, built in the 30s, and it's extremely well known. If you talk to anyone who lives in Madrid, any architect from Madrid, they know it's like one of the absolutely standard projects, like maybe the Barbican is for people in London. And yet, in the Anglophone world, it is almost entirely unknown. Now, why do I think it's clever? It's built on a big urban block, and the cleverness of it is this double perimeter. So we all know that perimeters help with density. We know that from the work of Leslie Martin and so on. And this double perimeter, I think, is a very interesting take on it. So what we've got is a garden in the middle. So we've got a central garden here. And then the blocks on either side themselves have a courtyard, an open to the sky courtyard, from which they are accessed. And you can see the courtyard here. And every apartment looks out either onto the street, so you've got interesting urban life going on all around you, or it looks onto the central garden. And the access is, as I say, from here. And so you have basically kitchens look out over the access courtyard, and the main rooms look out either over the city or over the central garden. And the blocks vary in height because they're limited. The ones on the periphery are limited by the urban ordinances and controlled. And the ones that overlook the central garden can be higher. And so that's what they do. And I just think it's a really interesting and ingenious way of providing density and the things that we want in our cities in terms of open space and prospect and so on. And you might say, well, why is this unknown in the Anglophone world? I guess it's because in the 30s, people in the UK and the USA were looking to Germany and Central Europe. They weren't looking at what was happening in Spain. So this was never published in UK periodicals at the time. And if you look at the standard works in English on 20th century housing, you really find no mention of this project. And I think that's quite interesting. And this is my final point, really, that we think of ourselves as, living in an integrated culture, and that we all know the same things, and that you could get architects from across Europe into a room and they'd all know the same projects. But that's actually not the case. There are still national cultures that prevail, and things that we don't know are absolutely taken for granted in other countries, and things that we take for granted here are unknown elsewhere. And I think that is really has been for me the value of this project, that one understands that and one hopes to contribute to overcoming that by bringing together the perspective of these four different experts on housing. So I just need finally to say a big thank you to my co-authors, because obviously without them this book wouldn't have happened, and it's been such a pleasure and such an education for me to work with them. So Simona, Carmen, Dick, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everybody for listening to this presentation. Thank you.